From the Toronto Star, I'm Raju Mudhar, and this matters. We all know the most famous line from The Godfather.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
It comes from a famous scene where various people are paying their respects and kissing the crime boss's ring. Can you even imagine something like that happening in an age of physical distancing? For many of us, the world of organized crime seems glamorous.
As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
As it is depicted in movies and television series like Goodfellas, The Sopranos, and Narcos. The reality is obviously much different. And like all sectors of society, this pandemic has these sophisticated organized criminals scrambling as they try to find a way to exploit this current chaos and uncertainty. To discuss how organized crime has been affected by COVID-19, we are joined by Peter Edwards, a reporter on the Star's Courts, Crimes, and Justice team, who has also written 15 non-fiction books on organized crime, many of them becoming national bestsellers. Peter, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Peter, this is an interesting thing because organized crime, like the mafia, run like a business. So it's been disrupted by the virus like anything else. Can you tell a little of the way that it's not business as usual for these guys?
There's some things like gambling that are pretty much shut down, like sports gambling. You can't even get caber tossing going right now, so there's nothing to bet on really. That's suffering. Drugs, they're still coming in, but it's harder to distribute them. Like the networks are shut down. A lot of meeting places are shut down, and so you have to do things on the internet, and some of them just aren't that great on the internet. Some are pretty good. So they've had to rethink. On the other hand, people are panicky. They're vulnerable. There's a bunch of government money that's been freed up, and so there are opportunities, and some of them, especially the sort of more cyber-savvy ones, can really see an opportunity.
One of the things about this is that due to its very nature, it's a very face-to-face business. You mentioned that these guys have their restaurants and their hangouts. They're all closed. I assume that they don't want to use phones. In-person meetings are being scrutinized more than ever. How are they adapting? I mean, are they going on Zoom calls and trying to do some of this stuff?
You can do some stuff on the phone, but you have to trust the other person that you're not dealing with an idiot. Like sometimes they've brought in one person too many onto a line and then the person's left the password out, that sort of thing. You can have 6 smart guys and one dumb one, and the dumb one can drag everybody down. And so there's that sort of fear. With some of them, I mean, Hell's Angels are supposed to have monthly meetings, and you can't really do that without getting hit for respecting isolation. So there's a lot to rethink.
You talked a little bit about sports. That's one of the first things that fell to this virus. Can you talk a little bit about the gambling business? I mean, it's funny. You mentioned you can't even bet on caber tossing. I assume that these guys are actually looking around for some more and more obscure sports, but obviously those have some issues. But this clearly is one of the biggest hits, the fact that illegal gambling has basically been sort of taken off the table right now.
Yeah, it's huge. You see some ads for online gambling, but sports has its own kind of loyalties. They'll come back, though. I mean, it's one of the ones where you just have to hold your breath, and these people aren't going to become non-gambling addicts during the virus. So it's one that's short-term painful, but they can get around. The gambling is in the Toronto area. A lot of it has been between mob guys and Hell's Angel guys with servers in the Caribbean. And so it's been a huge moneymaker, and it goes back to early 2000s. There was a huge bust in 2012, but they just split into smaller groups and kept on going.
What about the drugs? I think there was a story last week that a large cocaine shipment was stopped at the border. The supply chain has been disrupted, like a lot of things right now. Can you talk a little bit about how that's sort of been broken up, but then also what's the trickle-down effect for people on the streets?
For preferred customers, things aren't that bad. Like prices on the street in Montreal and Toronto aren't that bad for the big customers. But for so-so customers, sort of person you might meet at some shady place for a small amount of money, it's just really not worth it. A lot of the drugs come across the border in trucks with little compartments welded onto them where the owner of the trucking firm might not even know that this is going on. And so this sort of thing will carry on. There won't be a day when there's no cocaine. What will happen will be the chemical drugs, methamphetamine, fentanyl, the ones that have a whole bunch of different ingredients, some of them which come from China. Those are harder to put together now because you just can't get the shipments in from China.
Have you seen anything about price? Has it been affected yet?
It's gone up a bit. It took a little jump up, but then it still is a competitive business and you still have to keep your customers. And so far, it's not the big spike. There also was a limited amount of stockpiling. Some of the Mexican cartels, which would work out of Chicago, they'd bring in a shipment, say if there were 10 kilos, 4 would be kept for them, 6 would be put on the street. And so they didn't want to lose control of the price in the market. So they're already keeping stuff on the side for themselves. And so they want to have control and sort of make some people and break other people. And so there'll be a bit of a holdover from the stockpiles. There aren't huge stockpiles, though, because you just don't want to be sitting on a bunch of the stuff because it's just too tempting for other people to come and take it.
It's funny that we're talking about this because I think it was about 2 weeks ago. There was a drug dealer in Hamilton who was busted for selling cocaine. And then the police also busted him for not being an essential service. So,
and I guess that's their definition of essential. I'm sure some of the people who wanted it thought it was pretty essential. But that was interesting because these are the guys who have the problem is there are a lot more police on the streets. And so there's a big irony. There are fewer police working the really, really sophisticated things, but there are more police just driving around in cruisers. And so some of the bad guys are getting freaked out because they're seeing police everywhere and they can get pulled over quickly. Like now you can get pulled over for taking your 6-year-old on a swing, or you can get pulled over for 3 cyclists talking together. And so these bad guys can't do their walking, talking, dropping in on people's stuff like they normally could. And it makes it harder to unload your drugs.
what has been the effect of the construction industry finally being shut down?
It's funny because a lot of these guys invest in businesses, and so there's the initial thing about you have a project going and you're getting paid for it, and you think of yourself as legitimate, even though what's funding it is illegitimate. You have other people who you've employed who they've lost their jobs too, and then there's a spin-off where construction equipment thefts have dropped because there's no one to sell it to. If my business is shut down, I'm not going to pay you to steal equipment from my competitor. And so I thought that would go up, but I checked with someone and it actually went down because why do I want to buy a big truck if I can't use it? Like I'll wait until the business gets going and then I'll steal the truck.
One of the things that I learned from your story is that a lot of this vehicle theft is done to order.
Yeah. You don't want a whole bunch of it lying around. Like it's sort of odd, but now police can see, they call it who's who in the zoo. You know, they can see who's staying where and who's doing what and whose vehicle is where. And so it's too obvious to have a whole bunch of equipment just lying around. And if you're all of a sudden have 10 new trucks in your yard and your competitors lost 10 trucks, it's kind of obvious what happened.
Sorry, who's in the zoo? Is that the term for surveillance?
Yeah, and it's just sort of who's hanging around with who and who's getting along and who isn't getting along and what might be happening. Is there an interesting group hanging around a restaurant in Yorkville that normally doesn't hang around it, and the restaurant's owned by a bad guy from a different group? That's the sort of thing that's watched quite a bit.
Are you hearing anything like that? Is this exacerbating any sort of rivalries?
I think that a lot of that's moved on to the dark web now. Like up on the surface, you don't see as much. What is interesting that I'm watching for a lot is the organized crime element to the tow truck wars. Like a lot of tow trucks have been set on fire, and on the one hand there's less business because less people are driving. On the other hand, it means that the business there is more precious, and you still want market share for when things get back to normal. So that's being watched pretty carefully, and it's not all criminals fighting, but some of the fighting is definite criminals.
The tow truck war absolutely is something I wanted to talk to you about because it seems like it's been going on for a while. There's been some talk that there's increased competition between certain companies, but you do believe there's an organized crime element to that as well.
With the Bandito massacre, when there were a half dozen bikers murdered near London, Ontario, a huge amount of them were involved in the tow truck business. That one showed quite a bit of how it's done, and it's something that's very, very unregulated. I was trying to get things from the Freedom of Information Act about what's being done, and really not much is being done at all. For a long, long time, tow trucks were thought of as good because I could have a tow truck and I could be hauling a car and the car could hold drugs. And if the police pull me over and find drugs in the car, I can say, well, how did I know I was just towing the car? That's an old scam from way back when. It's the type of job you can get if you've just gotten out of jail. It's the type of job that you can control a territory in. It sort of fits a lot of these guys' personalities, really.
Peter, that's fascinating. It makes sense when you put it that way. But obviously, I'd never thought of it that way. But you mentioned something about the dark web. One of the things that the crimes that is actually thriving right now is online scams. There's obviously many framed around fake cures, probably some with the government money. How is organized crime behind a lot of those?
Phishing, like it's an easy way to get into someone's computer. On Facebook last week, I had a approach from someone who said he's someone I worked with at the Toronto Star, and it wasn't that person. It was someone who had stolen his identity on Facebook. And the person who contacted me was saying I can get into all these government programs connected to COVID-19 and that he had gotten $100,000 and why don't I get some too? And it was really an attempt to get my social insurance number, all this other private information, and to get me to send it around to other people so that they could do the same thing. I spoke to this expert in Oxford University, a criminologist, Federico Varese, who's a big deal in this stuff, and I told him about this, and he said he'd gotten the same thing. I mean, they're sending them out to everybody. He got fake Oxford University professors offering him this and offering him that, trying to get in on his computer.
And these were obviously the more sophisticated criminals, at least technologically speaking.
Yeah, but you just need one smart guy working for you. Like one geek can drive a lot of dumb guys. If you hire the geek, you don't really have to understand how he's doing it, just that he's doing it.
Two of the other interesting things that you've mentioned in your piece about this is the fact that everyone is cash poor. Obviously, they probably weren't expecting something like this to shut everything down. But then the other interesting thing is that plenty of people are landlords as well. And obviously, there's a lot of talk about rent relief. How are you hearing these two things playing out?
It's interesting because the cash poor one, way back in the Great Depression, that started in 1929, the organized crime in the States used that as a time to shift from extorting business, like you're running a business, you're making lots of money, so I just demand some of it. Then your business dries up, so I can't demand it because you don't have it. So what I do is loan you money when you have trouble paying it. Then I assume control of your business and maybe keep you as a front for it. And so it's actually a really good time to buy into mainstream businesses, and hearing about that in healthcare businesses in Europe as well. So it's a pretty scary thing when you start getting into private hospitals, ambulance care, that sort of thing, which is what's popping up. The landlord one, COVID-19 surprised these guys as much as anybody else. And so if you control a plaza and you've got 6 tenants there and they can't pay you, well, they can't pay you. So you can be the toughest guy in town. It really doesn't matter. They still don't have the money. And so some of them are hurting, and some of them have put money into legitimate businesses and nobody can come out to buy things from them. I know someone who has a clothing store and, nobody's shopping for clothing right now. At least if they're shopping online. And so you have to all of a sudden get creative on how to sell things online when it's not really your forte. It's what you normally think about.
Hopefully that crime geek has some e-commerce skills as well.
Those guys are more valuable to them now. Like, it's funny because it's the same skills that the mainstream world needs. It's just being used on the other side. Like, it's like there's a line and they're just taking them to the other side of the line, but it's the same skill.
Peter, you mentioned that you've heard about some of these criminals in Europe looking at healthcare opportunities. Now, that's really scary, but that sort of leads into my next question is what are the opportunities for these guys right now? There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of uncertainty. How can they take advantage of the situation?
There's all sorts. I mean, what if hypothetically I own a bunch of land and there's something like a green belt, so I'm not supposed to build around there, but I'm close to politicians and they relax the green belt. And then part of what I use to put in a development is the attraction of there's going to be a new hospital there. And if I have people on the hospital board, part of it through donations, then I can sort of quasi-legitimately change the green belt and change the development pattern without really pointing a gun at anybody. And so that's a good one. In Mexico, and this is always quite troubling, there are a lot of real but hijacked drugs. And so if you can pressure a medium, small-sized pharmacy to sell your products, then you're doing pretty well. Shoppers Drug Mart has actually warned people about bogus emails sent out where people claim to be from Shoppers and they're trying to get healthcare information. There are lots of things. One thing about healthcare that really appeals to these guys is it's not going away. I mean, the baby boomers are getting older, they need the care, and lots of government money is going in. Also, when you have a state of emergency, the tendering process isn't as rigorous as it used to be. Like if maybe they were 5 checks on things, now it's down to 2 or 3. And so your chance of corruption goes up.
One of the interesting things that I read this past weekend was about how in Italy there are some communities where the mafia is supplying food to some towns. Are we hearing any heartwarming stories like that around here?
No, I haven't even heard of a free hamburger in Canada. We're not being so heartwarming, but the thing in Italy that's going on in Brazil, in Mexico, and in some other places with extreme poverty. And it's a way of making yourself kind of the controller of a neighborhood. Also, it's no good having a business if you're dying and your customers are dying. Like at some point, you need a certain amount of people alive for your business to work. Here in Canada, I haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen any nice acts of charity from organized criminals. I think it's more kind of a sweaty panic stage right now and a let's find a geek we can trust stage. That's kind of more of an extreme poverty type of thing.
You talk to a lot of experts around the world for this piece. One of the things that a lot of people are saying, it feels as though crime overall is going down because of this. But in talking to a lot of people, it really does seem that organized crimes, they're in sort of a panic phase, but they're clearly looking to try to find a way to take advantage of the situation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and they do well out of disasters. Anytime there's a shuffling of the deck, they do well. Back in 1884 in Naples, there was a cholera epidemic, and they did extremely well out of that. And so there are opportunities. When there's panic, there's less reason. When there's panic, you're willing to just go to the person who can take you till tomorrow. You're not thinking long term. Someone's going to come up with a fake cure and people are going to jump on it. And if someone's stupid enough to allow it onto the market, that'll be a huge opportunity for somebody. As much as we're nervous, things like testing really do matter. And we've got a fair amount of integrity here, and it really does matter in our healthcare system.
Peter, one of the things I love about your dispatches is some of the lovely language from some of the characters. You end with a great line in this last piece where someone is saying, they can't stop because the monthly nut is too big. What does that mean?
They don't get a monthly paycheck, but the idea there's just too much money in this for all of these guys to become librarians or for all of these guys to get postal routes or to, find some other honest job. There's just too much, and there's the hope of even more. Some people are going to get fabulously rich, and there's always the hope. And they do pretty well out of it. I mean, when you go by their houses, they might not be the very best house on the bridle path, but they're pretty good.
Peter, one of the things he said when we chatted offline is that a lot of these guys are bored like the rest of us, so they just want to talk. I mean, what are they saying? What are you hearing?
Well, a lot of them are getting reintroduced to their wives, and it could have been a good or a bad choice. Like now they're getting, that's something. There's the cooped up with the kids thing. I mean, if there's a hyperactive kid, now that's not someone you can just flee from. The kid can control the household as much as anybody else's household. There's a lot of day-to-day things that bug them just as much as anyone else. What if you have a dog and you want to bring your dog to the vet? That's a big production now. And if you're a criminal or not, you still probably love your dog. So there's all sorts of things. What if you have a mistress? I mean, that's not going so well now. There's all sorts of things that are kind of up for grabs. What if you had shaky control of a group and someone else who's better with technology might see this as an opportunity? There's time for people to get paranoid. There's one joke sort of in this world about help them being chased by paranoids. And so it's a good time for them to be paranoid too.
Peter, this has been amazing for us. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks. That was really fun. Thank you.
That was Peter Edwards, a member of the Toronto Star's Courts, Crime, and Justice team. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudhar, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.